Good afternoon, everyone. And you can hear me, that's good. This next session is going to look a bit at the recent reconstruction or revival. We can discuss what might be the best way to describe it, of Kenneth's work Playground, which was made in 1979, premiered at the Edinburgh Festival on the 24th of August of that year, and it was subsequently shown at Sadler's Wells and on tour, possibly into 1980, but we're not quite sure. But it did not remain in the repertoire after that, so it hasn't been seen for 40 years. It was commissioned from... I'll just speak loudly. Oh, great. It was commissioned by Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet from Kenneth MacMillan for a triple bill of his work to be shown at the Edinburgh Festival, sort of celebration of him as a Scottish choreographer. And it was shown alongside the perennial favourites Concerto and Elite Syncopations, and Playground was the meat in the sandwich, so to speak. The original cast was the youth, played by Desmond Kelly, the girl with makeup, in inverted commas, played by Marion Tate, her mother, by Siobhan Stanley, the vicar, Stephen Wicks, his wife, Judith Rowan, and artists of the Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet, of which I was one. So the context, just to give a bit of context of this, MacMillan had stepped down from directorship of the Royal Ballet in 1977, which made him free to concentrate on choreography, especially on Meyerling, the big project which came about in 1978, and also enabled him to work on some fairly uncompromising and difficult subjects in work around that time. He had selected music by Gordon Cross, and when he started making the ballet, he began with an idea based on the Orpheus myth, but soon abandoned this and decided instead to make something with his own narrative and drawing on his personal concerns. So it's worth noting some influences to this work. Earlier in the year, he had made My Brother, My Sisters for Stuttgart Ballet, which was a dark piece about family relationships, sisters and one brother, and that was made in May in 1978 and taken into the Royal Ballet's repertoire early in 1979. Also, earlier in the year, he had seen Dennis Potter's play Blue Remembered Hills, filmed for television, in which adults portray children playing children's games which go wrong. And Kenneth was very interested to collaborate with Dennis Potter on a screenplay about Nijinsky, but this didn't materialize. But other more personal influences, perhaps, were were family memories of his own older brother and sister, and also of his mother, who had suffered from epilepsy, and his own feelings about that. Also, another feature that fed into it, I think, was apparently observations of his daughter Charlotte, who was then aged 6, playing with her friends, and Jan Parry's wonderful biography also talks about his own fears and doubts and fears about madness and being sectioned. So a lot of dark, personal things coming up, really. And the piece is in some senses also, you could be seen to be reminiscent of the Borough in its enclosed setting, really. So why remount this work now? And I'm going to introduce Yolande Yorke of the wonderful Yorke Dance Project, who are doing this, to come and talk a bit about how this has come about.
Hello, everyone. We had, as a company, revived Sea of Troubles a few years ago, and it was a fascinating process for us because we are a contemporary ballet company, and it was the first time we'd actually had the opportunity and the honour to do a Macmillan work. So after we had done Sea of Troubles, I talked with Deborah and Charlotte MacMillan about other ballets that we could possibly do, and Playground was mentioned, and we talked about it, and it sounded fascinating. Earlier when we were talking about reconstructing work, it was familiar because there are a lot of challenges when you're reviving a work like this, which was from 1979, primarily because there's only one, well, there's two films. One is of a rehearsal and one is of a rehearsal on stage, so there was no costumes. It's in black and white, it's very fuzzy, it's in from...
I was just going to say, harking back to what Diana Curry was saying earlier about the wonderful Edmund Wood footage and how clear it is and how you can actually see things. The videos from the 70s are just horrible. And you can't see anything, everything's fuzzy, the quality's bad, and so it's really problematic as a source.
But I think that the subject matter was fascinating. I think there's a quote saying that I think Kenneth had seen a company like Pina Bausch performing this work. So for us, it sort of suited what the kind of work we do. So we set about to revive this ballet. Essential to reviving this is to have dancers with us to coach us who have been in the ballet. I don't think we could have brought it back with its integrity without Stephen and Susie. There's the original Benesh notation, which we followed with Jane Elliott. And as I said, we did refer to the film, but there was, as things go from rehearsal in the studio to stage, things change. So you're having to look at what actually ended up being on stage and being true to it.
It's worth saying the first video was filmed in summer in rehearsal in Barons Court. Before the company went on holiday, it must have made it in June, July. So the video would date from then. The ballet then went on in August, end of August in Edinburgh, but the second video was filmed in rehearsal at Sadler's Wells probably in September. So a lot had happened between the first video and the second video, and that's very apparent. There are evident changes. So it raises some really interesting questions about, we have in effect three kind of working versions of this piece. We have video 1, in which some things are really clear, and we have notation score, Grant Coyle's beautifully neat notation score, and then we have video 2, which is after the work had evolved in performance. So it's been an interesting process of negotiation between these different versions, really.
And just to say that it's been wonderful to, we've had many meetings before we even got into the studio with Deborah, and also Charlotte MacMillan, Deborah and Kenneth's daughter, who has been brought in to reimagine the costumes and the set that Yolande Yorke had actually designed. So it's been really wonderful to have her be a part of this creative process, and many discussions as to in every element, we've discussed this at length to make it really true to what it originally was.
Because one has to remember, when we first did this was done in large theatres with a cast of 18 people and a full live orchestra, and Yolanda's set was a massive construction of a wire enclosure. And Yorke Dance has 6 to 8 dancers in the company and tends to work in small theatres and doesn't have an orchestra. So already we're looking at having to make quite significant adaptations and see how that can be done while remaining true to as much as possible to the letter of the original, really.
Yeah, much discussion was made. Obviously, it was on Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet, so all the females were on point. We had talked a lot about what can be done on point, what can be done off point. And so we've retained the lead female is on point, but everyone else is not. They're on flat ballet shoes. We have brought in students from Central School of Ballet and Rambert School of Dance to become part of the other dancers on stage, so they make up our chorus of dancers. We did have the full cast, but we have adapted that as we go on tour. So, for instance, we're in Frome next week, and we've gone from, I think, 12 to 6 dancers of the chorus. These adaptations have been made, but have been discussed at length as to what will work and what doesn't work.
And I think some of one of the reasons it's possible is because this ballet has a kind of a real mix of balletic material and naturalistic movement, and the ensemble and the big challenge in a way, particularly perhaps for student dancers, is that the ensemble is on stage for the whole piece. They don't go off, there is no let up, so it's a real challenge in terms of its ability to sustain an atmosphere and an environment throughout the whole piece, really. So that we'll talk about that when we show some things.
There's only one other thing I was going to just add into the reconstruction, was that there was never a recording. I didn't realise this at the time, but there was never a recording of the music. So when we got to sort of come to the studio, I was like, oh, there's actually no music. So we went through a process of, can we had the piano reduction. We had that discussion. I got the piano reduction, then realised it was for 4 hands, so that meant having 2 musicians on stage, the difficulties of having a grand piano in small spaces, again, all these things that came up, but we thought we can manage it, we can do this. And then we realized actually it wouldn't actually be, you could do it, but actually you wouldn't get the full effect of the ballet if you had a piano reduction. So then we set about researching how we could have this music, and so we looked into getting an electronic recording. And so we had someone do a tester for us to see if it was going to sound good enough, and thankfully it did, and we got everyone to sort of listen to it and make sure that it was going to be good. And so we had it recorded electronically, and that's what we've been using.
So I'm just going to read a little quote from Jan Parry, because I think it gives an idea of this central thing. And she says, "Without being able to resort to close-ups, MacMillan knew how to focus an audience's interest on the important characters. The minor ones," this was talking about Myling, "the minor ones, true to the Royal Ballet's acting tradition, played out their sub-stories on the periphery." So I think that's kind of a little bit what we've had to try and evoke, really. So I just, a couple of things. We've talked about people have been really interesting about where Kenneth drew his sources of inspiration from. Amazing interest, wide-ranging interest in music, in books, in contemporary happenings, and in cinema. But he doesn't tend to reveal or discuss these notes, either with the dancers or in program notes. His program notes are short and elliptical. I would speculate that this was a very wise way to operate, because if he had been a bit more explicit about, I have taken my influences from this, that, and the other, he might have been held to them and judged against them in a very literal way. And rather than that, he has just absorbed them and lets the influences mix and emerge. So he's free to adapt and construct storylines and characters and pick and choose what to draw on and what not. When we started work on Playground, we didn't know anything. We didn't know what it was about. We didn't say a word. We just played children's games. We spent a lot of time doing clapping rhythms. And it's debatable that he probably wasn't quite sure at that point where it was going anyway. But it was only, I think, when we were a few weeks in that he said, actually, you're not children. By which time something had been set up, something was emerging, really. But that makes another really interesting problem for reconstruction or revival, in that when we know with hindsight where this piece is going, how do we respect this in the working process with a new cast? You know, how much should we tell the cast about it before we start? And we rather took the decision not to tell them where it was going, but just start as we had started, with clapping and so on. So, on that note, let's see a passage from the beginning of the piece, which I think is self-explanatory.
Yeah, this is the very opening section of the playground. So we have just 2 students with the company today, so that there's actually more people that we work with. I think there's probably 4 dancers missing in the group, but you can come on.
So just a few things to note about that. First of all, a couple of musical things, really, about the challenges of this. The clapping, originally, when we did this, we had a curtain, and the audience would clap when the conductor went into the pit, and as the audience were clapping, the curtain would go up and reveal all of us clapping on stage. So that's been something that we've had to renegotiate, because sometimes we're in the companies in theatres where there is no curtain, and obviously there is no conductor. And that's also made some of the clapping things really quite challenging, because there were complex clapping rhythms which were clapped by members of the orchestra, and obviously we haven't got those. And also there was no conductor to coordinate said clapping by dancers and musicians. So that's been something that we've had to kind of work out. And I would like to just introduce briefly Ed Mitten, who has been rehearsal director and who's done absolutely amazing work with Jane Elliott on the teaching of this rather complex piece, really. Heroic. I thought it would be just fun to point out, when they all do, that is called the reaping step, and it's a borrowing from, of all pieces, La Fille Mal Gardée. Here, popping up in a very different place, really. So this scene can be seen to sort of establish an ensemble and an environment which frames central relationships. So John as the intruding youth, and Oksana as the girl with makeup, and Freya as her bossy mother there. And to establish all the children's games, which are already there in Gordon Cross's score, with a sailor went to sea to see what he could see. So, and you'll see, so there are all the skipping games. Later there's some hopscotch. There's clapping games, and there's playing with Meccano and playing at families, really. So the youth. So you've got an interesting setup of adults being children, playing children, playing at adults. So very complex kind of setup here. And the youth, as he's called, is perhaps the person who is, the one person who is older than the children, really. And is the archetypal outsider figure. Apparently, when Desmond Kelly was first in this, he kept saying, "Kenneth's not using me. I'm on the outside." What? And that was pretty much it. That he was the outsider, and the person who comes in, who disrupts the group, and who doesn't play by the established rules, and is punished ultimately. And I can't help wondering whether this was perhaps in some ways a metaphor for what Kenneth was feeling about his time with the Royal Ballet, possibly having that. So we're going to show another extract, which is the very first. There are two big pas de deux in this, and we're going to show the first of the two. So if everybody wants to. Yes. Yes, before that. Yes.
Break apart and pull together, and we won't go into the circles.
No, no, thanks. So just again, some points to comment on really is the sheer difficulty and awkwardness of this pas de deux work. And it was probably made possible because its original casting had this central partnership of the very strong and experienced partner Desmond Kelly and the tiny and pliable Marion Tate with her wonderful expressive lines. And as we've seen earlier today, Kenneth MacMillan has an extraordinary body of work extending the possibilities of pas de deux, always to expressive ends. So this ballet came shortly after Marling, and I think what we saw earlier, you can see echoes of some of that material in this work. The manipulation of the legs, the swinging of the legs around there are some real resonances, I think, there, but with a very, very different type of relationship. And I would say that the defining characteristics of this relationship seem to be that it's tentative and exploratory, it's also manipulative and potentially violent. And this characterism is built into the dance material itself, into the awkwardness of its holds and the manipulation. And also the sort of stopping and starting of it. So they try something and they think, okay, let's try something else. So it's got a very particular quality about it. And also, what was mentioned also earlier today was that it wasn't about looking beautiful. It's about building this sense of this relationship. It doesn't, in some senses, it doesn't require acting. It just requires attentiveness to what it is, really. And the emotions and the sensation of it will emerge from that. The other thing I think it's really important to notice, and this is, I think, is a feature of Kenneth's work always really, is that it doesn't project out to the audience. The focus is on each other, or on the characters in the environment. So it creates a world in which we as the audience look in as voyeurs, really. And I think one thing that a characteristic of his spatial design of phrases are those phrases that travel across, given that in a theatre, most people be sitting over there, so you get to see moves in profile, so you can see the whole shape of the move, but without the dancers projecting out to the audience, so that you have this sense of looking in on them. And he only seems to use fully frontal focus for very special moments, like Juliet sitting on the end of the bed, taking a life-changing decision, you know? So he uses those moments incredibly sparingly in his work, really. And I think it's a hard thing for dancers to do these days, is to not project out. I think for today's ballet dancers, everything is frontally projected, or a lot of work is very frontally projected. So it's it takes real discipline to just stay in the world, really. So we're going to do another extract, and Stephen's going to kind of look at this and coach it a bit, so that you can see a little bit of give the kind of feedback that sort of the rehearsal, give you a feel of what the rehearsal process has been like. So if you're all right to go into we go from the angel onwards. So this shows it introduces some of the characters, namely Ben and Abby, who are the vicar and the vicar's wife, and their role in this strange little world. And and we're going to go from that into the second pas de deux, I think.
Hear me? Hello. Yeah, you need to really suffocate him, really close. I want your body so it's more, yeah, it just becomes more hideous. Yeah, yeah. And the second one also when you jump on John's back. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Good. Yeah. Good. More sort of, yeah. And this arm's free, isn't it, for Oksana to take? Yeah. Yeah. I just want to see sort of naughty vicar. Naughty vicar's wife. Yeah. It's all about body contact. And then in the pas de deux here, the first, this again, before, I think you just need to, it all happened too quickly. We need to see this here first. And then, nasty, nasty, because it's just slightly turning the atmosphere to not very nice. Boom, boom. Just like a rag doll, yeah, good. Really, yeah, and yeah, that's good, that's really good, that's great, yeah, that's great. Yeah, really reach, yeah, yeah, this was fantastic, legs absolutely right, and then, yeah, this was great, and just into the shunts, as I say, again, you need to really get in behind her, because I can see daylight between your bodies, fine. And it could even be lower. Shunt, yeah, great, that's great. Head's great, yeah, that's fantastic.
Do you think should it be like about these hands?
You can be slightly fascinated by hands, I think. What can I do with these? Oh, I'm gonna do that to her. Yeah, all the lifts were brilliant. I thought really fantastic. It looks amazing.
There is actually a photograph of right up here.
Oh, right, before that. Oh, well,
Okay,
maybe
yeah.
try that. Yeah, maybe try.
Yeah.
Just try that maybe. Accent it more, sorry. So, ragdoll moment. Oh, yeah. Ah, oh, yeah, good. Yeah, marvellous. Yeah, fantastic otherwise, really great. Round of applause.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's quite an adult ballet in some ways, I think. And I think it's just worth pointing out some of the characteristics of how Kenneth is exploring the use of the floor in this ballet, as he does in Meyerling, and things, and all the slides as well, which are made possible by the point shoe, that you can do these extraordinary sliding actions. Becomes a bit more difficult in flats, as you found. It's really, and I think also the other thing to point out is that while this extraordinary pas de deux is going on, there's also extraordinary weird stuff going on around the edge. It feels like it is Kenneth's really cinematic sense, where you have foreground action and hazy things in the background, and that's kind of the challenge for the ensemble is to get the balance between doing these. I mean, I always think that the thing with the feet is just utterly weird, and so it's being able to have those wonderful weird moments and these men walking around slowly, but not to distract the focus from the main pas de deux. It's getting that sense of depth of field, if you like, into what's going on. And I think also it's just worth showing how the relationship between the two of them has changed. It's moved on to something. It's almost the one kind of lyrical melody in the whole piece, the one extended melodic kind of line there, so that gives rise to this much more sensual kind of movement, less jerky than the first one, really. And this pas de deux becomes the trigger for group censure of the youth and the ensuing violence. And we haven't got enough people to do the full beating up, but I did think it would be really interesting to just try to try and give a sense of the next section is remarkably complex, with everybody doing different things all at the same time. So I just thought it might be really interesting to deconstruct, to get Stephen to Ed to put this together for you, to give you a sense of what this was like in rehearsal, with all the different people having to do different things. So if you would.
Do you mind if I do? Can you all hear if I don't have the thing? I find it a bit weird, sorry. So let's look at in pieces. So can we just quickly first see what's going on between the vicar and the girl? This is throughout trees, so your bourrées and the jumps and the praying. If you just kind of walk it through, just to have a look at your track, sorry. And then you're teaching Oksana to pray. That was before.
She's to be finished for what she's done.
Lovely.
With me.
Good. Good. What about the group and John? So in fact, we'll go bunny hops into the capturing and then out to the trees. And Dane, I won't do the club journeys just yet. I'll look at them in a moment. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. just these tree people. I'll give you 5, 6, 7, 8, and then into the first one. So 5, 6, 7, 8. Go 1, go 2, go 3, go 4, go 5, and 6, and 7. Good. Good. Let's do that in just a moment. And then, if trees, could you take your tree places, but we won't have all the shaking, just at stillness, so we can see what the thugs are doing amongst this. Just from the gestes across, and crochet in, and heading back, and then chase it. Together with music, all of the layers at once. Is that yeah? Right. So from we'll hear the tug tune and then go into the bunny hop. Trees. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Brilliant.
That was terrific, considering. Got to imagine there are even more people in that, really. It's probably that's probably the most complex and action-packed section in the whole ballet, isn't it? And
all of these.
Yeah.
With
With about 6 groups of 3 all doing something different.
on the page, your first one is up in this direction, the second one is nothing, and then that has to happen for 12 people, so
That's a major piece of work there, really. And I think also it's a real example of the difficulty of choreographing randomness, really. That, normally one would perhaps think these days to do something like that with improvisation, set it as an improvisation task. But when you're working closely with a score, with things that have to happen at certain times, and with a lot of people in a small space, you need to plan it, and it's about the most intricate possible thing. And I think from a notation point of view, the notation score becomes very, very complex at this stage, with every character. It's not nice, tidy quarter ballet people all doing things in lines. It's every single individual doing something different. So that's what it's a challenge, really. After this, the girl has a solo which leads into her having an epileptic fit, which is watched by the group. And then the youth is further beaten up, and the doctors arrive, and he's confined in a straitjacket. The ballet is drawing here on Kenneth's own painful personal memories of his mother's epilepsy, his reactions to her fitting with conflicting emotions of concern, but at the same time embarrassment. And we didn't know anything about this when the ballet was being made. We didn't know anything of this. So with the girl apparently dead on the floor, we proceed to the next extract, which is a funeral of sorts. So here we are again with here we are with game playing. Is Oksana playing dead or really dead? And in the ballet, she actually, the next thing is that Freya comes and picks her up, and she's had a gag put on her mouth. Freya removes that, and everyone goes away. And I think it's really worth just drawing attention to the solo that Freya did as the kind of chief mourner, almost. Her character here very much echoes the character of the creator of that solo, Siobhan Stanley, who was a strong dancer with a powerful jump, quite a rebellious character, unconventional. And she can really be seen to be embodied in this solo, and it's a wonderful example, really, of Kenneth's observant nature picking up on the characteristics of a very particular performer and building a character out of that. Incredibly skillful at that drawing, as we've seen before today. Yes. And the other thing I think it's really worth talking about is this, in a way, is the one bit of ballet dancing that the girls get to do after all the skipping and clapping and shaking and all the other things. And it's really, it was quite challenging to learn, wasn't it? And it's, I think, because it's, they're not on point anymore, but it is inherently based on point work and on a very upright, lifted body, which is what you would need if you were on point. And so it's a kind of really interesting example of how something that's apparently very naturalistic and falling off balance is actually rooted in some classical technique. And that was a very characteristic thing of the movement language here, that Kenneth is drawing on classical, on the foundations of a classical technique to pull it off balance and to fall off it and to extend it beyond what you might think it was possible. And interestingly enough, there's almost a little quote here from Balanchine in this step, which observers of Balanchine might recognise as the girls from Melancholic, which actually had, I think, we had been doing. We'd been doing 4 temperaments around that time. So it's a kind of, it's very fascinating to pick up these, I don't know, intentional or unintentional resonances to other things, and rather suitable that it should be melancholic in a funeral, really. So I think that's the end of our extracts, and it's really just, I'd like to say thank you to the dancers who just...
I just want to add something. I telephoned Gordon Cross, who is still with us, but unfortunately travelling to Scotland any moment, and he's sort of rather ill and couldn't come. And he said, first of all, he was completely gobsmacked that he was going to work with Kenneth MacMillan. And he said, oh, you know, there was I with this great choreographer. And he said, Kenneth had a completely different view of the piece from me. In fact, there were 4 temperaments, 4 humours, I think: earth, air, fire, and water. Kenneth cut air and left the rest. And he said he was very bemused because Gordon Cross said he felt that the piece was rather joyous. He said Kenneth took a different line.
One thing I didn't say about the music, but which has been a real challenge, but one is really fascinating about it, is that quite a lot of it is arrhythmic. It's not, there are no fixed lengths, it's just long drawn out notes that we don't know how long they go on for. And they're set against very defined clapping patterns and things. So it's really rich in the sense of how you can coordinate things that are absolutely fixed and rhythmic, and dancers counts to know when that everybody's going to arrive at the right place at the right time all together, with this sort of aleatoric stuff. And I think it makes it a really fascinating score, actually. And we didn't count this at all, I don't remember. We never counted it. But I think as you get to know it, and the dancers can perhaps confirm this, you begin to feel the shape of it and the phrases of it and the sections of it, and you begin to know when things are going to happen.
Do you all count it now or not? No?
I was wondering whether the clapping at the beginning. Oh yeah, last time. Yeah. Okay, now you have the clapping at the beginning, and is there a kind of mirroring of rhythm different sections throughout. I was thinking of the retire jumps. Are they related, do you think? Or? I don't know, they seem to be musically.
That's the challenging thing, that some things are
And some things aren't. Yes.
So how do you coordinate to arrive at the things that need to be together so that they are together is requires a lot of just getting to know it.
Could I just ask Yolande why you decided not to do it all on point?
We're basically because the company isn't, we don't do point work, so it was very much about what the piece before Sea of Troubles was the first ballet, I believe the first ballet he made that wasn't on point. So it suited the company, and then we wanted to take that further, so we talked about what ballets could possibly work not on point, because we didn't have the dancers. Oksana is our guest artist, and we have Romy Pajak from Royal Ballet, who's also doing this part. So, we some of the dancers do point work, but it's something that we talked about what could work and what couldn't work, and this we felt that we only really just the lead role needed to be on point.
Yes, I think for all those for the sliding stuff, I think would be virtually impossible not on point.
There's some over here.
Oh, don't make that.
Sorry, Sue. I thought there were so many interesting references, if you like, with so many of his different works. So Rite of Spring really came to me, partly the original music one, which I'm working on a lot, but also Macmillan's one, and music. This atonal and at the same time as they're doing Macmillan's key wriggles with the legs around the body referencing sex, and it's kind of this primitive thing and what happens in the playground when it gets out of control. I thought it was fascinating. Well done, Susie, and everybody else who's done this. Yes. Yeah.
Well done.
I just wanted to ask Susie, following on from the point work question, whether you think there's anything lost here, because you were in it. I know you probably wouldn't have seen it, but do you think there was anything lost by not having the whole ensemble on point when you were rehearsing it and working on it?
I think potentially it's because there are so few moments. It's really just that last phrase for the ensemble of girls that requires them, and possibly Freya's character. There's a very characteristic the fat lady walk, which she walks on the front with. But on the whole, I think it's been all right not having. But what did emerge in the doing of it was that you need to have the sensibility of the sense of the point work in the body, in the lifted body, in order to be able to do these things and then tip them off balance, really. So I think that you kind of need that feeling, that awareness about how those steps were arrived at, really.
I think we did look quite closely at what was on point and what wasn't. And I think that, what we've talked about is really getting the steps dictate the characters and what's going on. And other than that step, there wasn't anything that there was nothing that's seen or felt or that was lost in it by not being on point. Yeah.
I mean, this the vicar's wife, when you carry her in, she lands on point. That's rather, but that's fine.
I thought his work, I agree, it's fascinating, and I love seeing the resonances with other pieces. I thought there were some resonances with Sea of Troubles as well.
Yes.
Quite a few things.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
And West Side Story. Did you come up with that?
It's
true. It's the primitive gang. Yeah.
For we residents of Oxford, I think it needs pointing out that there is an opportunity to see the full work in April in Banbury. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
never had point shoes in the JD.
Oksana has christened the line.
But it is really amazing to be able to see that aesthetic close up in relation to the other kinds of work that we saw with Sea of Troubles and here as well with Bare Feet and demi-point work. Yeah, okay.
Can I just ask one more question, Yolande? After your experience with these last two, are you inclined to look further? Because it seems to me there is an interesting fit here. And the ballet that came to my mind, actually I was probably too ambitious, is the Judas Tree, which I thought had very strong relationships to this latest development of. That's probably too far because you need an orchestra, I suppose. But, and also a very big cast of men. I just wondered whether you've got others in mind.
Yeah, I mean, we have brought guest artists in for this work, which has been wonderful to be able to do that because they, and I think for our dancers, it's such a wonderful opportunity for us to learn and be in these MacMillan works because they've been only in major ballet companies and as you can see, these dancers are capable of doing all this work, and also it's really enriching them as artists and for us to get really into the nitty-gritty of the work. It's been fascinating. We have talked about what other ballets that we could do, and I'd love to pursue more.
I had one more question about when is it set? Was it contemporary to 1979 or does it go back? I think it feels earlier.
The blue, if you look at the Blue Remembered Hills, the Dennis Potter thing, and that was set during the war. The children were, so the boys are in grey shorts and it's very, and to a certain extent the first Yolande's costume design echoed that. So you had
much stronger image.
And when we had our first meeting with Charlotte, when we were all discussing this, and she felt quite strongly that it needed, that would put too period a feel on it, and that actually there are really universal things here that could speak tremendously strongly today about bullying and gangs and abusive relationships, and it's got a lot of it says a lot of things that could have very contemporary resonance. And Charlotte was really keen to have something that was not so period specific, but that had the sense of things that were slightly off, but not so almost caricatured grown-ups dressed as children, really. So that there's always a kind of an ambiguity. There should always be, I think there's always an ambiguity in Kenneth's work. You can't, it's open to different interpretations, and so it feels right to leave thing a little more open, and I think she's done a great job, really.
Yeah.
Really great job. In that sense.
Okay, is that it? So we seem to head to time. Can I ask the dancers what it feels like? Yeah, what it feels like to do it.
I found that through performance it makes more sense than when we were putting it all together in the studio, because the intensity is there on stage, and although you need to create that sense of intensity in the rehearsal studio, there is always something more heightened on stage. So I feel like things become more obvious for me as a character, as the slightly insane character that I play. They become clearer and more natural on stage than in the studio for me.
Anyone else want to have a
John, how does it feel because for you, because you're the sort of such a you change everything when you come in?
I mean, I think when I learnt it, and I think similar to what Freya was saying, I sort of learnt my journey, and then the first time I performed it on stage, I sort of very much think about music and trying to just not overact, just react to things that are happening. And then the second show was when I suddenly had a sort of feeling that, gosh, this is quite strange, and psychologically, some of the things that are happening are quite extreme. I think I sort of felt like I was confronted with Oksana, and all the makeup was all over her face, and I didn't know that was going to happen. There's so many things that I suddenly I felt like actually it's much more extreme than I thought it was. And the things that are going on in the corners when you sort of catch them in your eye, because obviously when I'm dancing with somebody I'm thinking about that, and that's when I start to see the kind of psychological side of what was going on, mother, father, all these layers that are seething around the edges.
Anyone else? How does it feel to do the stand?
How does it feel?
How does it feel to perform this piece?
Well, as I heard John, it's very loud, sorry. It's very emotional, but also it's very, because everybody who's on stage have a character. I think that's very much influenced everyone's performance, as John said, because because of it. And it's very different. I don't know. I feel very different in the studio to being on stage, because everyone comes out on stage even more so. It's very emotional, and it's weird to do. And I feel at the end of it, a little bit disturbed, because there is a scene like doing scene at the end, which is the epileptic fit, which is quite. I feel really, it is challenging trying to be true to it as much as you can be, because I mean I don't know how to feel to have an epileptic fit, which I've looked into it, and it's really disturbing, and what happens after that in the end, because there's a little scene after that leads, and I think when you see the end you realise what's really happening. And it unfolds in front of your eyes at first. Maybe you think it's not quite sure what's really going on, but I think to me it's really tells the full story to it.
I think I'm going to have to hire a bus to take us to back.
I think the journey's been amazing for certainly Susie, myself, and Jane, incredibly emotional, because it's incredible. I've not really seen a lot of contemporary dance, so this has been my introduction into it. And to see this amazing group of dancers you have, Yolande, are extraordinary. And we haven't gone about imprinting as I said earlier, we're not creating carbon copies of us. We've let the dancers explore, and then their characters, and it's just been amazing. Then with the amazing costumes, Charlotte's costumes. There was one day where everybody just suddenly stripped off and they went, whoa, that one, grabbing the costumes and dressing up and sort of looking in the mirror, and that really helped to create their characters. And from where that first day in the studio to tonight and to the shows I've seen, I mean, I know Deborah is incredibly emotional in some parts of it because it is very violent, but I think for all of us it's just been an amazing journey, and from Susie and I just want to thank you guys, because it's been fantastic for us, so thank you.
Can I just ask a question? There was a plan to maybe do some workshops with schools to do with bullying. Is that still happening?
Yeah, we have been, this has been a really wonderful opportunity. We do a lot of education work, and because of the playground games and the bullying, we decided to actually put together a very specific workshop to take to non-dance schools, so local comprehensive schools, and we worked with a dance therapist, a child psychologist, and with our education youth here, Laura. So we did, they all came to the rehearsals, they observed rehearsals, they took notes. Laura's still taking notes. And we have been doing a series of pilot workshops in various schools. And just to, we had our first one in Pimlico Academy, and we had, we confined it to, how many students did we have?
12 in each workshop.
12 in each workshop. We had all boys, all girls, and then a mixed one, and they were age ranges.
Well, each workshop, there were students from year 7 to year 9, so it wasn't just one year group. And it was, we did the whole workshop, and at the end, they were chatting amongst themselves and to us, and they're like, "Well, I pass you in the corridor now, I'm going to say hello." So it kind of intermixed the year groups as well.
Yeah, and the idea was to explore physically what it feels like when you're being bullied and how you can change that. So you had a lovely, because I couldn't be there because of my foot. But
yeah,
so
so
just tell that story about the boy.
Yeah, so one of the exercises was on your own, create an image of alone, in pairs, create an image of gossip. And then Ellie was assisting me that day, and Ed was there as well. So we were sitting in a group, and then I got Ellie to recreate her alone pose. And I said to the group of boys, if you could change this image, what would you do? And one boy went, "Can I get up and change it?" I was like, "Yes, of course you can."
Change it for the positive. For
change it to the positive, yes. And he started to mind pouring some water into a tap. And then he poured it over Ellie. And in my head I was thinking, "Oh God, where's he going with this? What's going on?" And then I asked him, I said, "So what are you doing there?" He went, "I'm just giving her water because she's a plant and I want her to grow." And it was just and then they redid it, and Ellie just, as the water was going on, Ellie just grew. And it was just really beautiful. And then another boy, his alone pose was sitting how Johnny's now. And another guy just went, "Can I change this?" And all he did was went and sat next to him. And it was really beautiful how he just didn't make eye contact, didn't talk to him, just sat next to him.
So we're just, we're taking what we, using examples like, Laura would do clapping games, taking sort of elements of what is in this ballet and going into schools. And some of the schools have, kids who do go and do dance classes, so they're not all non-dancers, but the idea is to go into non-dance schools, local comprehensive schools, so they can be introduced to dance, but in a positive way, and look at how bullying can affect you physically and what you can do, what they can do to change the outcome of it. So that's what we're still piloting, we're evaluating as we go along, but we hope to, even beyond, even when we're not touring Playground, we can still take these workshops out. So it's been really hugely valuable to do this, learn how the ballet is created, and then use it as ways to go and do workshops.
Yolande, I think we're really honoured to have you here. And it's just been an amazing opening up for St Hilda's as well, for you to come into an Oxford college and put this on and show, what's going on in the world of dance out there. I think is really, really very important, and we're very lucky to have had you today. And thank you to all the speakers and to everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. And thank you, Natalie. You were amazing. That's pretty interesting music, isn't it?
It is.
Really interesting.
And the wonderful thing is this electronic realisation of the score is going to transform an awful lot of touring, because it's a very simple, as far as I understand it, it's word processing, if you like, the lines of music into a system called Sibelius.
Yes.
And so that it actually sounds like an oboe or a clarinet or strings or whatever, and then it's all mixed in a huge mixer. So it actually is, as they would mix individually my symphony orchestra, except it won't cost £70,000. It costs rather less than that, and it's so eminently tourable. So it bodes frightfully well for other big works like.
I mean, it took him 2 months. One person, 2 months. I mean, it was very complicated, but we have versions with clapping, without clapping. So he gave us lots of different options on things. But yeah, it's amazing for us.
I haven't heard what Gordon Cross thinks about it.
He said he was really pleased with it.
Oh, good.
But also he himself has worked with electronic.
Oh, he gave up composing because he thought the serious music world was some big crap. So he went to India. So he sort of went into IT and did a lot of IT and then got excited by something which happened about 5 or 6 years ago. Has gone back to music. So he was very excited about all this, and I hope he's coming to see you at the Claw.
All right then, well I think on that note, thanks to everybody for coming. There will be drinks in a couple of minutes outside Russell Mop.
Can I also say that one person who hasn't been thanked is
Susie Crow knows.
Working on this a long time.
But also in the university, that's something that has not been disseminated enough, I think, within the university walls. There's probably somebody here who I am offending, but hopefully